Okay, everyone, it is just about 8 o'clock, so I think I'm going to get started. Welcome to TE Reads. We're doing our ongoing slow and deliberate read of Rabbi Sacks's book. As you may know, it just recently won the Book of the Year award for the Jewish Book Award Festival. It's a major piece of work and a major honor and richly deserved. So I think it repays a nice, unhurried read to really take it in. And this session, as I had indicated in the teaser, I wanted to double click on this issue of post-truth. And I wanted to just start, all of us were alive for 9/11. And we remember after 9/11, terrorism, the Homeland Security, the Patriot Act, Iraq, Afghanistan, right? And then all of us also are well aware of issues and questions about racism and et cetera, particularly since George Floyd. What he writes in this book, and I just want to read one sentence to just launch us. A majority of Americans now view fake news as a more serious national problem than terrorism, illegal immigration, racism, or sexism. 70% say that it undermines confidence in government. And as you know, he goes on to talk about the roots of this. So I want to just start off with a few questions to hear from you. Number one, what did you think of this chapter about post-truth? And then number two, we'll start with two questions. What did you think of the chapter in general? What was your reaction to it? And how does his treatment of the issue of post-truth in this chapter, chapter 11, how does it sync up with the world that you're living in and with the country that you're living in right now? Do you think he is nailing the problem or not? And then we'll go deeper after that. But I wanted to summon initial reactions of how his chapter on post-truth applies to our world right now. So what I'd love to ask you to do, because we have a nice number, we have 72 participants, is if you will indicate in the chat room that you would like to speak, and I would love to hear all your voices. Anyone who wants to talk, we would all love to hear your voice. So what general reactions to the chapter, and how does the chapter on post-truth link up with our world right now? Anyone want to offer any preliminary thoughts? Ellen Cass, please. Ellen, if you can unmute, I'd love to hear from you. Now we can hear you.
Okay, I think that Rabbi Sacks was brilliant. I think he could have written this yesterday. I felt as though everything I read was a commentary on what I'm listening to on CNN. And on the one hand, the truth of it had such an impact. On the other, it scared me to death, because this is what we're witnessing. It's what we're living. It's what we're watching. And the fear that we're not living in a world where truth is valued and represents what our leaders are striving toward terrifies me.
Yeah.
That's
and indeed, Ellen, I think what I hear him saying in this chapter, chapter 11, is it perhaps is even scarier than that, because there are multiple truths that he would call narratives, and that the insurrectionists on January 6th had their truth. They're saving democracy. They're right. If you ask them, they're patriots. They call themselves patriots, right? They're saving the country from a stolen election, etc. They're patriots. And so the problem is you have warring truths and no truth. You have warring truths that are multiple and no broad acceptance of truth. And that leads, as he says, to no trust and therefore no shared society. So very pertinent. Glenn Seidman, love your words.
Hi, everyone. Yes, I just wanted to say briefly that I do feel he's right on the mark where he provides in an articulate way how this problem is so systemic, but how it leads to mistrust in everything, which really wreaks a lot of havoc with everything.
Good. Now, does anyone, as I read this, it just felt like Ellen is saying, like Lynn is saying, it felt right on to me, but I wanted to invite a full airing. Did anyone disagree with what Rabbi Sachs says in this chapter? Does anyone have any qualifications about what Rabbi Sachs has to say in this chapter? And if not, that's fine. But if you did, I wanted to invite that. Okay, so here's what I want to do to take it deeper. And this was just so, I found this so powerful. He writes, when he's talking on page 165, he talks about Marx and Nietzsche and Freud. And then he says, but for all three, what was said was less important than what was beneath what was said. What was said was less important than what was beneath what was said. Truth was a capital T, in quotation marks, was a mere mask concealing the realities of power. And that I wanted to just to think with you deeply about. What is said is less important than why it's said or what's beneath it's being said. So I want to pivot for a second. We'll get back to Micha on Hillel and Shammai, because I had brought in Hillel and Shammai as another set of texts to think about. But as Micha points out in the excerpt that I sent you from The Wandering Jew, many of us are familiar in broad terms with this famous debate that Hillel and Shammai have. So give me a minute to talk about Hillel and Shammai before we get back to Jonathan Sachs. Hillel and Shammai have a dispute. What do you do if you go to a wedding, and this is politically not correct, but I didn't write it, it's in the Talmud, and the bride is not all that pretty? What do you say? And Hillel says that what you say is, oh my God, what a beautiful, radiant bride. And Shammai says, no, you can't say that because that's not true. And truth has to be absolute. And so you find something else to say, like, oh, what a lovely dress, or oh, what lovely flowers. But you don't say something that's not true, okay? Now, most of us had heard that before, but what Micha does in his talk is he says, what's said is less important than what beneath what is said. And he develops this argument that it has to do with Hillel has this very upbeat and positive view of human nature, that human beings are transcendent, and therefore we should be able to reason on the basis of our own thinking. Shammai thinks human beings are very flawed and therefore does not trust human reason, and therefore Shammai is much more slavishly adhering of biblical texts. So Shammai will read a text that says, don't stray far from the truth, and he'll say that eclipses everything else. So there was basically beneath their argument about the bride was a fundamental disagreement about human nature, okay? So I want to come back now to our world, to what we live in. What is this dispute really about? The people who see the insurrection as a riotous mob attacking democracy and have their truth, and millions of Americans who think this is the spirit of the revolution and that these are patriots saving our democracy. What would you say is, so we have these multiple truths. What is beneath the truth? What's the debate really about at bottom? And I have Joni Katz who would like to speak. Joni. Joni.
Yeah, here I am. It seems like a lot of it seems that one of the things we have to think about is how social media controls how it's unregulated. And that's one of the biggest problems we're having. There was an article in the Sunday Times by Shoshana Zuboff, who's an emeritus of Harvard Business School, talking about this, and she's on the circuit right now. She just wrote a new book. Meek has been talking about this for the last 4 years.
Right.
And it just seems that one of the biggest problems is the unregulated nature of the media.
So, yeah, Joni, no doubt about it. And Rabbi Sachs brings that up, that social media is an accelerant towards dividedness, you know, from we to I, and we all have our social media. He makes the point that the move from we to I paralleled the move from Walter Cronkite to your social media source of news of choice, that we don't get it from NBC, CBS, and ABC. You know, most of us get it from our own little social media source, and that there's no real fact checking on media, all of which is an accelerant of this. So that's absolutely correct. But I wanted to just, so thank you for that. And he definitely points that out. We to I, and from Walter Cronkite to multiple social media sources, none of which is fact checked, has accelerated this problem. But I still want to, and by the way, I don't have the answer to this entirely. It's a real question. What is at bottom of this? Why is it that in 2021, that there is such a warring narrative of what the truth is? And what is that bottom about that? And Joan, did you want to speak to that? And then I'm going to get Judy Safir.
There's no such thing as what is truth, because my truth is not your truth. It's not an absolute anymore. And that's what we have to figure out how we can get to agree on even the smallest thing of what truth is.
Okay. Judy Safir, I would love to hear your voice.
So the way that I have understood what's going on is that the old world as we know it is dying, and a new world is trying to be born. And I see the people who stormed the Capitol as holding on to the old world. And part of that old world has to do with white supremacy. And people are very frightened. I mean, we're in the midst of environmental catastrophe, and there's so many problems. Like, we don't know how to get our arms around or to use technology with any kind of wisdom. Things are changing so fast, and people are frightened, and the world as we know it, like before coronavirus, I don't think is coming back.
Right. So Judy, there's no doubt that coronavirus has created so many crises, multiple, that we all know about, health and economic, et cetera. But I'm sure that also, like social media, is an accelerant of the warring narratives that we have. But I do want to say that, you know, somehow our country went through the Great Depression, and we went through fighting Adolf Hitler and World War II. And we went through sending our boys to storm the beaches of Omaha. And somehow all of that danger and uncertainty and menace did not result in this explosion of different narratives and different truths, and two parts of the country not speaking to each other. So like the social media, I think what you say about coronavirus, it's true, it's an accelerant, but I still am in search of what is at the bottom of this whole thing.
I think it's an existential crisis. I mean, the planet is collapsing.
Okay. I want to ask, I'm just going to take this in the order in which they were offered. Lori, you had something to say here as well.
Can you unmute me?
Yes, you're unmuted.
Oh, hi. Yes.
Thank
Well,
you,
some of it's already been mentioned in terms of narrative. And I think that, you know, I'm thinking back to even when I was a freshman in college and took a history course, and we used two different textbooks, and that people do, you know, they speak out of their own experience. And I think that, you know, in reading Caste, we see the same thing, that, you know, we're now understanding our own American history in a different way, from a different perspective, based on hearing from other people. So I think that it's very hard to, I mean, unless someone were to somehow be above us, looking down and extracting various stories and kind of aggregating it, it is hard to know in some ways what truth is.
And, and Lori, what you say that's so super scary is that from the point of view of people who supported the January 6th insurrection, they have their own truth.
Absolutely.
Right? And they feel totally threatened by, the things that comfort us threaten them.
Yes.
And right. And so then and he talks about how such a society that doesn't have a shared truth and a shared trust cannot survive unless his answer, which he hints at the end, is developing a shared moral code. And the question is, how do we do that when there are so many? His solution at the end of chapter 11 is only a shared moral code can save the day and bring back a shared sense of truth and a shared sense of fact and a shared sense of trust. But when there are all the divisions on a moral basis that Caste and other books advert to, how do we do that? So let's hold on to that. But I think what you say is right and super scary, because everybody, in other words, everybody feels aggrieved. They feel aggrieved by the people who don't see my truth. Bob Braitman, would love to hear your voice.
So I think that Rabbi Sachs nails it when he says that truth was a mask concealing the realities of power. And when people feel powerless, they may then feel that their truth is the way for them to feel that they have some power. Without defending who should have power and whether the rightness of their feeling powerless is appropriate. I think that gives strength to their feeling that their truth trumps the truth of what they're reading in the media and the so-called standard media. So I think that sense of powerlessness is very powerful and perhaps needs to be resolved before we can have a common sense of morality that he calls for at the end of the chapter.
Yeah. I want to, Bob, I want to just build on something you said, because in reading, Lori talked about caste, and we'll talk about caste at the end of this, but in reading caste, I came up with an insight of something that had baffled me a lot, which was, there are literally millions of American citizens, millions of them, who feel even now that the election was stolen. Right? They feel in their kishka the election was stolen. And if you say to them, okay, I hear that, but the institutions of our democracy have spoken. 50 courts with duly appointed judges have spoken. And many of those judges that spoke were appointed by President Trump. The Supreme Court voted 9-0, including 3 justices appointed by the President Trump, not to disrupt that. And the Attorney General, your own Attorney General, said there was no fraud. And the Director of Cybersecurity, your Director of Cybersecurity, said there was no fraud. How then, if all of the institutions of democracy, not to mention the Secretary of States, many of whom, like the one in Georgia, were Republican, if all the organs of democracy and institutions of democracy spoke and said no fraud, how then can you still assert your truth, capital T, in quotation marks, that there is fraud? And I think that what I've now come to understand, that what was said is less important than what's beneath what was said. I think beneath that is the feeling that my place in America is eroding, and I don't like it. I'm struggling, and I don't like it. And other people who used to be a lower caste are thriving. They're cutting in line, to use the language of strangers in their own land, and I don't like it. And that's their truth. So when they say there's election fraud, they're not talking about ballots and counting. What they're talking about is, I don't like the direction the country's going in, because I'm not thriving. By the way, if it's a winter day, I shared this with my sisterhood class. If you're looking for a movie to watch, this is a movie from 1971 called The Last Picture Show. And Last Picture Show is just a great, great American movie. One of the, it's a classic. It's about a Texas town, all white, that is just not thriving. It's just suffering, it's languishing. And you see the citizens languishing. And that was it was made in 1971, and it purported to be dealing with the 50s. So what you have is struggling, uneducated white citizens for the last 70 years who are languishing. And it's from that space that a lot of this negative energy arises. And the last picture show concretizes that very dramatically. Danny Mando, you would like to speak.
Yeah, so what I would add to this is I think our role in society might be eroding, us as liberal American Jews. So Wes, you said something a few minutes ago about the United States and about our history and about making through World War II and making it through all these things. But the people that were attacking the Capitol, they've always been there. They've always been there. Maybe they felt, things were changing in society. So what's really scary is that they're getting their kishkas up, they're getting their backs up, and they're making themselves known. But they've always been there. So as an American Jew, I have a real dilemma, and it's a real moral dilemma, because there's certain things, frankly, that I really liked about Donald Trump's foreign policy. It was great, and from my point of view, for Israel. But then I see the people that are supporting him, oh my God, and this woman, this green woman, I mean, what's happening? So these people are becoming more emboldened, and the more they see what's happening in our society, it's very scary, because they probably always have been there, but it's Pasnish, they couldn't really speak up. But now they're feeling like, hey,
Right.
I'm gonna strut my feathers. So that's kind of what's happening, unfortunately.
Right. No, this woman, with the most outrageous claims, including that school shootings are staged, and there's enough, and she was elected on that basis. So talk about, she was elected on that basis. The more outlandish got her power. So and other Congress people are terrified of challenging her. We'll see where that leads. But that is, to your point and to our point, no shared moral code, et cetera, et cetera. I want to take a few more comments on this, and then I have a question to add to the mix. So I think, Annette Miller, you're next.
No, you asked a question of what is underneath.
Yes.
Why this? What's underneath? And I really think it has to do with power, feeling powerless. What is motivating people? I remember in early studies in my trade in theater and acting, was there are two things that motivate people. Some people are motivated by power, and others are motivated by love. And what's happening, I think, is what's beneath everything that's going on is the need for power and the feeling of loss of power. And I think that without, once we no longer have God saying what is moral and what isn't moral, once we sort of threw God out of the universe and looked at science, and then we started doubting that, we got a little bit lost. And I think we are in the process of people are trying to hold on to some power, some sense of self. And if they feel that eroding, now they may have been there all along, as you said, and they're more emboldened now. The reason that they're more emboldened now is that they can make up their own truths because it's so much more accessible to us because of media. So now they can just say that is what is, and more people can believe it. And I love his point about that we tend to go more towards fear than we do towards things that are at ease. And so you get the news. I mean, I'm so annoyed at the news, breaking news. And so I'm always like this because that's what gets us going more. And we have more of that. So that's perhaps why they're more emboldened. But I think what's underlying, to go back to your question, is power and feeling that it's eroding and wanting it.
Right. And therefore, if you want to sell to that, you offer stories that are fearful. fearful about scapegoats taking your place,
Exactly.
fearful about scapegoats arrogating your prerogatives, scapegoats that, and that fear sells. Okay, so now we've kind of, I mean, I think we've talked about the move from we to I. We've talked about the accelerant of social media. We've talked about the accelerant of the coronavirus. We've talked about the accelerant of, a world that, seems on fire and unrecognizable. We've talked about echo chambers. We've talked about fear. We've talked about erosion of power and economic, and not only economic frailty, but deaths of despair, that people are dying, whites, uneducated whites are dying in record numbers of death, of drug and alcohol and suicide, etc. And in that context, you just have different truths. And that is very scary stuff. So now I have the following question. We're in a synagogue Zoom talking about Jewish values. Rabbi Sacks, of course, is a rabbi. I want to ask you this question. Hillel and Shammai also disagreed about everything. Is there any wisdom to be had in the texts about Hillel and Shammai? So you remember, if you didn't get a chance to read this, but Hillel and Shammai disagreed about everything. And in the end, a voice comes down from heaven. Micha quotes this, it's from the Talmud in the Tractate Eruvin, and says, hey, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim, these and those are the words of the living God. There is light in both positions. There is wisdom in both positions. But the law is going to follow Hillel. And as the Talmud explains, and as Micha explains, the law follows Hillel, not because Hillel is objectively more correct, but because he is a mensch. He's light and forbearing. He studies both points of view. And in fact, he leads with Shammai's point of view. So, so he's open and curious and respectful. He's a mensch. And because he's a mensch, the law follows him. So here's my question. I mean, that makes a very nice page of Talmud. It's very nice. And we're very proud to teach that to our school-aged children, that we come from such a tradition. And I'm very happy to teach that to adult ed. Every rabbi teaches this passage about Hillel and Shammai. These and those are the words of the living God. But the law follows Hillel because he's a mensch. That's lovely. Here's my question. Is that model helpful to America today? Or is that model so naive, it actually has no bearing on America today? Does the Talmud's wisdom on Hillel and Shammai, which Micha quotes, which you've all learned at different times, does that help today? So please put, if you wish to speak, put something in the chat room, and I'd love to call on you on that question. Are Hillel and Shammai helpful, or are they just too soft and naive and not really helpful? So I'll add one other thing that Micha doesn't actually say, but it's in the Talmud. It's relevant. Even though Hillel and Shammai disagreed, they married their children married one another. So they shared, Hillel's kids and Shammai's kids, and disciples of Hillel and disciples of Shammai shared the same Shabbos table. They couldn't disagree more on the merits, but they shared the same. They shared the same community. So thoughts on, can that point us in the direction of finding a shared moral code? Anyone? Bob Kahn.
So, yeah, I think that Hillel and Shammai are still the gold standard. And I think leaders, in both parties talk about, wanting to achieve that type of respect for one another, even though they don't achieve it I think it's recognized as the gold standard to be hard on the arguments and not hard on the people, and to have respect in your debate. But I think for it actually to be achievable, it gets back to the second point that you make about Hillel and Shammai, in that even though they had debates, the families married and they were part of the same community. In other words, there was a social contract. And I think for us to get back to a more respectful discussion in the public sphere, we're going to have to really work on the social contract so that, the folks who feel that this economy and this society is just not working for them anymore, that they are now the losers. And, globalization is good for each coast, but it's not good for the people who live in between. So that's, they feel that, the social contract is broken. They work hard, or they're trying, but they're not surviving. So I think to get back to respectful discourse, we have to pay attention to, mending the social contract and bringing more people along than what we're doing.
So Bob, I find that a super helpful comment. Here's what I take away from what you just said. That the response to, but there was fraud, is not, no, the machines were fine and the ballots were fine. That's not the line of encounter. What's really, what's beholden upon us is to get at what's going on underneath that line, that the election was stolen. What was stolen is your sense of security and your sense of safety and your sense of belonging. And that well preceded 2020. I mean, that's been forever. And our move is to actually respond to the economic and educational and health goals of people who feel like they've been left behind. That's really the response, because the statement about there was fraud is a symptom. The root is I feel not seen, not valued, not heard economically, educationally, in terms of health, and that's the move, to try to respond to that. So thank you for that. I think Marcia Slotnick, you are our next speaker.
I think in your question about how we can respond to Hillel and Shammai, the word is respect, and Bob mentioned it and you mentioned it. I'm dubious whether it can happen, but Hillel and Shammai did respect one another. They didn't riot after these discussions. They were vigorous discussions, but they listened to one another. And I think the problem is how we can get people to listen to one another and care about fellow human beings. That's gotten lost.
Yeah, and the question, Marcia, that arises is, can you have that kind of respectful conversation with somebody who says the Parkland shooting didn't happen, it's a hoax? What do you do with that? I mean, and are there comments that are just so beyond the pale that one cannot reason with them, like, the Parkland shooting was a hoax, and then in that case, or 9/11 didn't happen, or 9/11 was a hoax, believe it or not, 9/11 was a hoax, in which case, what if you can't reason with that? Who can reason with that? Then what does one do, particularly when there are enough Americans who put those kinds of views in power? Do you have any thoughts about that? What happens to respect when it encounters the absurd?
And it is being fomented by those who were enabling it.
Right.
No, but you have to, by censuring the person is at least a step, and then there are so many who are afraid to do that.
Yeah.
I don't have the answer, unfortunately, but respect is the word I would use.
Yeah. Let's see. I think Rabbi Maayan is offering to share some words.
So there are two interesting little things. One that I think offer an opportunity for us to use the text to reflect on the kind of values and morality that we can put into place here. The interesting thing about Shammai and Hillel, in addition to their, pleasant arguments and all that kind of stuff, the fact remains that both Shammai's opinion and Hillel's opinion remain in the Talmud. And that speaks volumes. I think it's one of the few places, it's a place where the Talmud holds up a mirror for us to look at and say, if you can manage to do this, a lot of other things will fall into your place. There's another thing that doesn't have to do with Shammai and Hillel, but it's a passage where the rabbis are arguing with each other about whether something's going to happen. And the bottom line is, Lo b'shamayim hi. The answer is not in heaven. The answer is not with God. The answer is among us. And if we can respect, if Hillel and Shammai can respect each other, then hopefully we can learn to respect each other too.
Right.
And we can together come up with an answer, which actually, I don't have any answers, but I don't think it's answers that we're looking for. I think it's discussion. I think it's open-mindedness. And I think it's the understanding that we do have the power somehow to make everybody feel seen and heard and not powerless.
Yeah, Mayan, thank you. I just want to put that together with Bob, because while you were talking about Hillel and Shammai are both recorded and they're both in the Talmud and they're both respected, I was thinking while you were saying that, but that doesn't apply to America today, because the position that the election was legit and the position that the election was stolen cannot both be in our Talmud. But then I realized what I took to be Bob's point, which is it's not about that. It's about how do we see and value and hear, to use your language, the people who are so hurting and so feeling abandoned that they come to this kind of position. How can we see them and ameliorate their place in life? And that might be holding on to both. Michael Gardner, I think you are our next speaker.
Thanks. I would just say that if Shammai said something that was the equivalent of the Rothschilds are shooting lasers down from outer space and setting wildfires, I doubt he would appear in the Talmud. I don't think it's possible, nor do I think we should grace outlandish statements like that with saying, all right, you've got a view, I've got a view, let's talk about it. I think there's got to be a commonality of acceptable modes of communication, and with people who fail to follow those acceptable modes, I don't think there's any way to, excuse me, to deal with them other than to push them aside and shame them. I'm sorry to be blunt about that, but I just don't see any other way.
Well, Michael, I don't think you'll find a single person on this call who's a fan of trying to find the light in the position that the Rothschilds are shooting lasers from outer space, right? That's we all agree with that. 93 or 96, whatever number of people, we all agree with that. The issue is, though, and this is in some ways the fundamental problem that we're all grappling with in our country, not just on this call, is there are millions of people who buy these crazy conspiracy theories. She was elected, and the question then is it, you could just have a continued uncivil war, to use the president's term from his inaugural address, and we just say the hell with them and never deal with them and let them rot in their own deaths of despair. And they'll continue to have their poison politics that comes from their poison place, and et cetera. Or is there some way, as people who share a country, we're not going to even engage the merits of their preposterous lies, but is there some way we can see the pain that gives rise to those preposterous lies and ameliorate it? That's
I'm going to answer that, but in a somewhat different way. The notion of are there truths, or does everyone have their own truth? I think you have to separate truth from interpretation. I think there are truths, and to me, the fundamental question I ask about almost every point is, and this is discernible, and it's something that can be determined and set forth, and that is any particular position that any particular person is taking at any particular time, does that have an effect of empowering or disempowering certain people? Because I think if you get to the ultimate conclusion, and I think that's knowable. For example, putting in strict voting requirements before people can vote, there's an interpretation of why someone's doing that. And people can fight about that all they want. But we know that if you put in these super strict requirements, it has the effect of disenfranchising certain groups of people. And by virtue of disenfranchising them, it keeps in power other groups of people. Those are true facts. One cannot argue with that. Now, one can argue as to why someone is taking the position we should have these strict requirements. But I think if we can get to a point of being honest, and I think it's capable of being honest, if a particular action empowering or disempowering certain people, that will dramatically promote the ability to have dialogue. Because once it's apparent that a particular action is empowering me or disempowering you, for someone who's willing to listen to that and see that, that can move the needle, I believe, because then you are, to your point about getting behind what's happening, that truly is getting behind what's happening. And we keep arguing, I think, but we're arguing about the wrong thing. We're arguing about, you have your interpretation, I have my interpretation. That's fair, and I'm never going to be able to persuade someone differently. But if we look at it differently and say, all right, is what you're doing going to empower someone and disempower someone else? And that is knowable, that is a truth. Then we can begin, I think, to have a real dialogue about what's going on. And that, to me, is the path to honest discussion.
great. Hold on to that comment, because we're actually starting, I'll talk about this at the end of our class in a few minutes, but we're starting a dialogue group, which is something I at least have never done, and to my knowledge, have not done at the synagogue in my years here anyway, a real dialogue group with the Black church arising from caste, which is to actually hear their lived experiences. I didn't even know that America was a caste system until I read Caste. And then once you read Caste, it's hard to come to any other conclusion. That's the right. And therefore, to hear about what empowers and disempowers, it has a lot of resonance in that context. There's Erica Quigley would like to say something.
Hi, thank you. Regarding the Hillel and Shammai and listening and whether that's relevant, I've heard about a group called the Braver Angels Project, or just Braver Angels. It used to be called Better Angels. And they organize conversations between people with opposing political views. And they have a sort of Robert's Rules of Order kind of structure for, you don't speak directly to someone. You say, Madam Chair, I'd like to ask so-and-so, more about what he just said. And the thing I've heard about these conversations is that people aren't, the ground rules are that you're not there to persuade someone that they're wrong and that you're right. You're just there to listen respectfully. And people come out of it universally saying, I can't believe we just had a civil conversation about these volatile issues. They're not saying, oh, I'm really frustrated that, he thinks this, or I didn't convince him this way. People are, even in tears saying, it's been so long since we could even have a civil conversation and not have it devolve into name calling. I'm hopeful that there is a vast middle ground for a lot of people, that the extremes that we're talking about, the space laser extreme and whatever other extreme there is on the far left, are getting a lot more press than they deserve. And I'm hopeful there this large group in the middle that if they had that opportunity to have a civil conversation without fearing that they were going to be attacked, that they might be able to do so.
Erica, that's so powerful. And I once heard on NPR something that I thought about as you were speaking, that there's this project of some women from Kentucky, Mitch McConnell country, and some women from the Berkshires. And they somehow struck up a conversation and they struck up a dialogue group. And the Berkshires women went to Kentucky and the Kentucky women went to the Berkshires. And they created some rules of decency and dignity and listening so that not to persuade, but just to listen. And they all testified, the women from the Berkshires, the women from Kentucky, that it made the hugest difference. And also that they just, like the women from Kentucky had never been on the East Coast. And the people from the Berkshires had never been to Kentucky. They couldn't locate where Kentucky was on a map. But when they actually sat around a table for a series of sessions in both people's communities, that was a tonic for the soul and for their relationship. And the question is, how do you scale that for a country? But it certainly worked in that case. I want to take two last comments, and then we will we'll close up. And I'll give you some spiritual homework that I hope can build in a small way from the challenge of post-truth. Ellen Cass, you had wanted to add one other thing.
Just very quickly, I really tried very hard to hear what Michael said and really agree with him. And I think that we run the risk sometimes of trying to make things too black or white. I agree that everything everyone has said has been helpful. That it has to do with power, fear, and all kinds of other things, and people who don't feel heard. But I just want to say that I don't think that you can look at a mob who comes with bats and clubs and guns to the Capitol of the United States when 5 people are killed and there's now a young policeman with a family lying in state, and think that those people are the people who don't feel heard. I think there are extremes. I think there is such a thing as evil. And I hate to say it because I don't know if I would have felt this way a year ago, but I don't condone those actions. I don't want to sit down with those people because I think they're evil and I think they're criminals. And maybe that makes me an outlier, but I don't think their truth is based on not being heard. It may be based on power in a different kind of way, but.
Right. So I want to, I just want to,
Sorry.
Yeah, I want to pivot from that comment and this conversation about this book, Post-Truth, to a project that we're doing now that raises a lot of the issues and that has some real work, and it's a different kind of move than we're doing now. So we're studying caste with the Western Avenue Baptist Church. And what's going to be different, and we're going to have a conversation with the church 4 Tuesday nights from 6:30 to 7:30, the second Tuesday of the month, starting this coming Tuesday, February 9th, from 6:30 to 7:30. What's going to be different about this is a few things. First, we're going to have breakout rooms, and we're going to, and those breakout rooms are going to be co-facilitated by Black people from the church and white Jews from Temple Emmanuel. And we're going to try to make those rooms, the breakout rooms, as racially diverse as possible. It's highly likely there will be a lot more white people than Black people, but there will be a Black co-facilitator for every breakout room. And the purpose of that is to try in a small way with one community to create better listening and to hear about the lived experience of citizens that many of us might have read about in books like Caste. But I don't know about you, but I don't have any Black friends. Like on my speed dial, there are no Black people. And my hope and goal is to actually create real relationships with people who live, 5 or 6 or 7 miles from here. Jeremy Battle lives off of Cabot. He's in Newton. And to really, and not just read books about a different experience, but to hear stories and for them to hear our stories and to build a real relationship. And where that goes, it just feels like, to come back to Rabbi Sacks, his diagnosis is where there's no truth, there's no trust. And where there's no trust, there's no shared society. And the only response to that is the development of a shared moral code. And I think a shared moral code can be worked on through the power of listening and listening to stories. So I would love to invite you to join this effort and to read Cast and to join us this Tuesday night at 6:30. Jeremy is going to tee up the issue. We'll go into breakout rooms. By the way, it's awkward, it's messy, it's painful, it's not clear. It may not work. It may not work. It may not succeed. But I feel it's definitely a noble aspiration. And if we don't do it now, trying to build, I mean, I love this, but we're all the same community. We're all the same community. I think the work now is to build relationships with other communities. Maybe one day we'll figure out how to do our own Kentucky move. But until then, there's a community in Cambridge that's a few miles from here that most of us have never encountered. So let's start with Cambridge and then we'll go to Kentucky. And let's try to create a shared moral code through the power of just caring and listening. So hopefully I'll see you guys on Tuesday. And thank you for reading this chapter. And let's continue our good work together. Erev Tov.